Okay. All right. We're going to be looking at Paul's letters here, a survey of Paul's letters, and this is the second class of this survey. We've already kind of looked at how Paul wrote his letters chronologically, at least the first two letters. We're going to make a little bit of a jump here, and we're going to talk about not necessarily the next one that he writes in the chronological order, but the next two after that. So you think about numbers 4 and 5, basically, is what I'm saying. We talked about 1 and 2 last week. We're going to skip number 3 for right now, and you'll kind of find out why next week. And we're going to go to numbers 4 and 5. Which letters did he write? And so this survey of Paul's letters, you have a really good view of, the map here of the world that is there in scriptures. A lot of, the popular world at the time, a lot of it being Asia, Europe, going on into Italy where Rome was. Rome had all this influence over this people. And so that enabled a lot of travel to be able to be done safely. Sometimes if it wasn't safe, it was because Paul was being kicked out of a place. And so we kind of know about that. But where we left off from last week, Paul had traveled so much. See if I've got Paul had traveled so much, and I'm kind of going through it rather quickly over here. We started last week talking about how he was in Philippi in chapter 16 of Acts. Then he went to Thessalonica in chapter 17. And then from Thessalonica, he went to Athens for the rest of chapter 17. And then from there on, he went to Corinth. So that's kind of the second missionary journey of Paul. And the reason I bring that out to give you all that recap is because it's important to what we're going to be talking about today. Knowing that when Paul was in Corinth, in chapter 18, he stayed there for, I would ask this question, a year and a half. And one of the questions that I wanted us to think about sort of logically, kind of like a common sense kind of thing, was what was needed to write a letter at that time. And as you guys know, what was needed was, literally resources, probably money, and especially time. Paul was a very busy individual. I don't think he would necessarily be writing letters while he was, being tossed about in the sea, while he was on a long journey on a road or something like that. He needed to sit down. He needed to write his thoughts. These were long letters. As we're going to see today, they were answering questions, some of them in the letters, and he had to, obviously being inspired by the Spirit, was able to answer these questions, but still, it took something out of him to do it. So he needed time. So being at a year and a half in Corinth, he actually writes back to chapter 17, the church in Thessalonica. So we talked about that last week. All right. So if you haven't already, you can pause the video and read through chapter 18 and 19 of Acts. And like I said, if you haven't read that already and that was part of the homework, then go ahead and do that now. Read chapters 18 and 19. All right, so hopefully you've done that. The reason that's so important is because we're going to be referencing a lot as we go through this study. So from Corinth, if you read through chapter 18, he leaves from Corinth. In chapter 19, he goes to Ephesus. This is pretty important. He spends a lot of time there, and we'll get to that in just a second, but we'll kind of move on from right here. Here's just a little bit of a timeline of the things that we're talking about. Paul was probably born, a lot of people kind of think that he was born around, 0 AD, 1 AD, something like that. And if that is the case, then, he was this old, we consider him at Pentecost, probably 30 years old, maybe 35, 34 when he was converted, became Saul. Saul became Paul. And all these things, and you can kind of see that timeline right there. One of the things we mentioned last week is that 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, when Paul was writing it from Corinth, was probably written around 52 AD, somewhere around there. And I think that's good. I might have misplaced that one, but here's some of the things that we kind of think is said right here at the end of the second journey. Is Paul is spending a year and a half in Corinth and then going to Ephesus. He spends a lot of time there, like I've kind of mentioned already. And in that time that he was spending there, he wrote a letter, as we believe, back to Corinth. And we'll kind of talk about some of the things that we see there. So, meanwhile, while Paul was in Corinth, there was a few things that he said to them while he was there in the year and a half, and some other things that happened. How Paul was working, he found some work there making tents. How uh, Paul and Silas or Silvanus, they were not with. I'm sorry, Timothy and Silvanus, they were not with them for a majority of the time when Paul got there. And so he was greatly encouraged when they did get there. So Timothy and Silas or Silvanus ended up joining him. He talks about that in early chapter 18, as you'll remember. So this goes back to chapter 17 when they got separated because at Berea, they basically made Paul leave because of a potential threat. But Silvanus or Silas and Timothy, they stayed up in the northern part of that area while Paul went down to Corinth, down to Greece. So that's something that you might remember from last class. But he was encouraged when they finally met him back, right, when they came to him. It doesn't necessarily say that. I don't think in chapter 18 that they evangelized to Crispus. If you want to go to that verse right there, Acts chapter 18. In Acts chapter 18, verse 8. I'm sorry, it does that. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with his household, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed, and were baptized. So it does mention Crispus there. Sorry, I've got my notes here. Sometimes I get them mixed up. So it mentions him evangelizing to Crispus, the head of the synagogue, which is really important because obviously a lot of people would have been influenced by that. And then he goes on to say that many were baptized. It says back in chapter 18, verse 8, says this was kind of a consequence of that, right? His influence, many were baptized. He stays there for a prolonged period of time. He talks about the Jews. And then he talks about finally leaving. If you go down to chapter 18, you read what it says again in verse 18. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria. And Priscilla and Aquila were with him. And when he had cut off his hair at Cenchrea, he had taken a vow. So now he has other companions with him. He's got that couple that we read about earlier on, Priscilla and Aquila, and they leave for Syria. And they go with him as far as there. If you read what it says in verse 19, and he came to Ephesus and he left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. So here, Paul takes the opportunity to go into the synagogue as is his custom, but now he is finding himself in Ephesus. So this is kind of how it happens here, right? Paul goes from Corinth, he goes now to Ephesus. He stays there for a while. He wants to get back to Jerusalem. He talks about some of those things that go on there. But Paul goes to Ephesus. And we believe that it is from this time that he wants to write a letter to Corinth. After all, he had just been there. We'll kind of talk about some of those things here. Here's some of the events that happened here. But as if you well know, if you continue reading on into chapter 19, it mentions in verse 10. In verse 10, that Paul being in Ephesus, and this continued for 2 years, that all who dwelt in Asia, which is where Ephesus is, you can see that on screen, right above Ephesus, it says the word Asia. That's the region. We talked about that last week, right? How the region's kind of like the state. You might want to think about the city, like Ephesus is its own city. It's a smaller section of Asia, so kind of think about it that way. Anyways, and this continued for 2 years, so that all who dwelt in Asia, so that's a pretty big, you can see there, it's a pretty big section, pretty big region, heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. So they had some success there. So he stayed there for 2 years. And as we mentioned before in passing, 2 years is a long time. So that way he's able to write something back to Corinth. And as we'll see, like I kind of mentioned early on, these are questions that they had. Think about some of the things that he mentions inside of the letter. So some of the things that are mentioned within Corinthians, and we've done Bible classes at Hueytown to talk about Corinthians itself, but there was division involving preachers, division in the church that sometimes stemmed from preachers. You guys remember how some of them felt prideful, maybe puffed up, because they were baptized by this person or that person, and you weren't baptized by him, but I was. And so that caused a big division within the congregation. I didn't know this, but I've heard of missionaries going out to other countries, and they evangelize and they baptize people over there. I've heard of some Christians choosing not to baptize over there in foreign countries and letting some of the locals do that, because they've seen it themselves that Christians will sometimes in other countries will say, oh, well, I was baptized by a missionary. I was baptized by, that individual who comes over here all the time. But you weren't, so they have this sense of pride there. So this isn't, it's not uncommon for us to kind of think about it like that. And it still happens today. Especially somebody with like Paul refusing to baptize them. Imagine if, they were saying like, oh, look, I was baptized by this individual who works all of these spiritual gifts, works these spiritual miracles, and wonders, who has these abilities. This is an apostle Paul. Like, I was baptized by him. Well, this is one of the problems there. And then some saying that they align themselves with certain preachers, I like this preacher. I like that preacher. I love what Paul says in chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians. It says it doesn't matter who the preacher is. It just matters that we preach. We're instruments of God. It's not that we're anything special. I think that's his exact words. We're not as if we were anything, basically saying we're nothing. We're just instruments. Don't align yourself with Apollos or with myself or with Peter or anybody like that. So some of the contents of 1 Corinthians deals heavily with immorality, verses chapters 5 and 6. You guys are probably familiar with that, right? The account of the individual who has having a relationship with his mother-in-law, more than likely his mother-in-law. I think that's what that means. And so you guys remember that, and how they had to deal with that, some of the contents going on there, some of the questions that they asked. Think about chapter 15, one of the bigger chapters for the resurrection, it's basically chapter 15 is just this, especially the first part, but even going on, it's this giant argument basically for why the resurrection happened, specifically talking about Jesus' resurrection. And then Paul goes on to talk about our own. And so that's pretty cool. And then the effects of resurrection, like it implies that when we are raised, that means death lost. Anyways, it's a pretty cool chapter. I say cool, and that might be, I'm sorry, that might be inappropriate, but what's the way I kind of think about it, because it's Paul saying, look, this is how important it is, and he lays it on, and I think that is pretty neat, interesting. I don't know how else I want to put it, that Paul is so adamant of how Christians ultimately will be victorious, not necessarily because of our own merits, but because we've enabled ourselves to live through Christ, die in Christ. And if those things have happened, then we're able to also be raised with Christ. And so there's a long conversation about that in chapter 15, 1 Corinthians. So you guys might remember that. Chapter 16, the very first thing he opens with is about a collection for the saints. This is important. It's important because we're going to talk about it next week, Lord willing. Collection for the saints. So we won't touch on that right now, but you guys will remember that, especially if anybody partakes of the Lord's Supper. That's probably a very common thing for brethren to read that verse at the beginning of the Lord's Supper. I'm sorry, not the Lord's Supper, the contribution. I'm sorry. The contribution. It's a very popular verse to be read. Anyways, he mentions this thing to them. And this is probably the most indicating thing to us that Paul was in Ephesus when he wrote this. If you go to chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, he says in verses 8 through 9, but I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a great effective door has opened to me, and there are many, but in some translation says there are many adversaries. So let me just say this. I said earlier, that's kind of when we think that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. It's not even that we think. He says this outright, right? Does he not? That Paul says, I'm going to tarry here in Ephesus, but I'd like to come to you. But there's also this great door of opportunity. So Paul felt like his work, like there was more work to be done in Ephesus. That being said, he felt like there was something also still going on in the sense that there were many adversaries. But Paul himself says, I'm in Ephesus right now writing this to you guys. So there's not even a question that he wrote this in Ephesus. And since we're putting this into chronological order, make sure that this is like the focus of our lesson still, that we're still putting it in chronological order. It makes the most sense that Paul in chapter 18 was with the Corinthians for a year and a half. And then when he leaves them, establishing the congregation there, making them settled, he goes to Ephesus. It just kind of makes sense that he writes to them. They had some questions. He heard of some things going on. And so it is Paul's desire to write to them. So it's pretty easy to figure that one out. And like I said, in chapter 17 and 18, we believe he writes back to Thessalonica. So chronologically, it kind of makes sense that the fourth and fifth letters that are being written are First Corinthians, and then eventually we'll get to Second Corinthians. But here's some of the similarities that go on between the chapter in Acts 18 and some of First Corinthians. He talks about tent making, and there's questions about him being supported as a preacher. As you know, Paul would rather have worked with his hands, and rather than burdening them, as he says, with the contribution. So he mentions some of that there. He talks about converting Crispus. If you want to go to First Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he mentions in verse 14, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. So he's writing back to Corinth, and we read about that right earlier on, how he baptized Crispus. And so he was just baptized Crispus and Gaius, and it was none of them, no other ones beside them, but still yet many were baptized. He kind of talks about that later on. He talks about Priscilla and Aquila being there, being with Paul. But if you go to chapter 16, actually, I think I have it right here. Chapter 16, it says in verse 19, the churches of Asia, which is where Ephesus was, right, greet you. Let me just say this about that verse right there. Chapter 16, verse 19, the churches of Asia. This is just, if you remember what we read at the end of chapter 19 of Acts, and I know this is like chapter 18, chapter 19 of Acts, and then chapter 16 of, we're going back and forth. But that's kind of how you have to figure some of this out. So it makes us good Bible students. And I could spend more time delving just deeper into these kinds of things, but I know all of this is good for your own personal study. Going back to what I was saying just then, if you'll remember, as Paul is in Ephesus, right, it says that he stayed there for 2 years and that everyone in Asia heard the gospel, both Jews and Greek. Okay, that's what we heard. Now, time has passed from chapter 19. 1 Corinthians is being written, and at the end of it, he says, verse 19, chapter 16, verse 19, the churches of Asia greet you. This is such an important verse because it means that that time that Paul was being spent, where everybody in that region heard the gospel, there was some fruit from it. Yes, we know Ephesus was there, but there were other churches as well. So that means literally what Paul was doing there, it was effective. Him and his companions, it was effective. Gospel preaching is effective. You don't need other things. You don't need these extra niceties and luxuries that go around with the gospel. The word of God is enough, and it worked here. And I think that's because he had committed people, right? That's why. There were people who were committed to evangelizing, and not just evangelizing, but strengthening churches there. Because once you evangelize, you can have a person who's become a Christian who falls away very easily, right? I think we understand that. We get that from the parable of a sower, although it's not necessarily just talking about Christians, but that's the idea there, right? Maybe they lose passion, maybe they're choked and distracted by the things of the world, whatever it may be. But still, Paul was not just dedicated to evangelizing, but also strengthening other Christians. And I think that's so important. That's why there were, as it says there, plural churches. Such an important verse. Okay. And it says that, anyways, going on to Priscilla and Aquila, he mentions them. Verse 19, the churches of Asia greet you, Aquila and Priscilla. They greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their house. So they obviously felt, like Paul, dedicated to people, had a congregation with them. It mentions at the end of chapter 18 in Acts that they went with him to Ephesus. If you will be reminded, they were kind of already there when Paul meets them, so they know about Priscilla and Aquila. So that's kind of something rather neat. He mentions about Paulus and Achaia. He plans on going through Macedonia. So let's look at that, what it says in chapter 16, verse 5. It says, "Now I will come to you when I pass through Macedonia, for I am passing through Macedonia. And it may be that I will remain or even spend the winter with you, that you may send me on my journey wherever I go." So his plan was to go back to Corinth, right? To go back to Corinth, um, but to go through Macedonia first. So kind of going like this. If you're looking at the map, and you should have a map with you. I think I might have given you all one of those. And from Ephesus to Corinth is going through Macedonia. So instead of going through a straight line, he instead going like this, going to Macedonia, and then ultimately going to Corinth. And thinking about he's even going to spend some time there, the winter. And if you think about winter months, that's like 3 months at the very least that Paul plans on spending there. But as he mentions earlier on, or later on, he feels like there's some adversaries, and we'll kind of get to that in a second. And some of the similarities that we see there, he says, he reports and questions from Corinth. This isn't necessarily something that you find in the book of Acts, but this is something that definitely is found here in Corinthians. If you go to chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, listen to what he says in verse 11. "For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you." So he hears that there's some problems going on in Corinth. And I didn't really talk about it earlier, but at the map, we talked about Chloe's household, somebody being evangelized to and someone being baptized. Well, they reported back to Paul, obviously saying to them, "Hey, something's going on here." And so there's a genuine concern for another congregation. What's going on in there? And that's very admirable. And then chapter 7, if you look at what it says there in verse 1, "Now concerning the things which you wrote to me." So they wrote to him about questions. It was as if Paul had not spent enough time there. And that's fine. That the church needed to grow, and they needed good leaders. Uh, I was going to almost give Paul a place that he doesn't deserve. What I mean is Paul obviously was almost like a father figure to a lot of them, teaching them. And so they had questions when he left. Okay, what about this? What about that? And so Paul writes back to them. So that's just kind of the things that gives us insight to maybe more of the personal connections there, the historical connections there. Some of the things that you might want to think about that come up in the book of Corinthians that kind of, we kind of get from history. If you've been in my Revelation class, you kind of know some of these things already. But some of the problems that were there, and I'm just going to go ahead and put most of them on there. Human wisdom. You think about how, there are probably some philosophers there, heavily influenced by Greek people, because it was Greek people primarily. And you can see how philosophy probably played a lot into their day-to-day lives. I think this and I think that. Well, I think this because of A, B. And they would do these very complex oratory debates, philosophies. They would do these mental gymnastics. And some of it sounded really pretty to people. Because of that, I think some of that crept into the congregations, right, in Corinth. So you might want to think about something like that. Business dealings. Corinth would have been a place of commerce, a lot of money going in through out of there. But it seems like some of it might have been bad. It seems like some of it might have been dishonest. And obviously, wherever there's money, there's greed. And whenever there's greed, there's dishonesty more often than not to try to get that money that you're so greedy about. And so you kind of see that there, right? It's obviously something that happens in our own life. The immorality, particularly chapter 5, sexual immorality. And then obviously in chapter 8 through 10, he talks about idols a lot. Those idols, right, are something that is just prominent throughout this time, right? People who are still tied to old teachings of so many gods. It was polytheistic. So this would have been part of the problem there. And then chapters 8 through 10, he talks about eating meat to idols and things of that nature. And then chapter 11, he jumps into meeting together and not having meals together, but you come together for the Lord. So you guys know some of those things, but these are some of the societal influences of the time, right? And you can put your mind there. And I think this is probably just one of the other problems, pride. There is probably a lot of pride issues. He talks about puffed up, and he uses that 6 different times. And certainly, if this is a wealthy congregation, because it probably was. These were some probably, and I don't mean wealthy in the sense that these were the kings and queens of this place, but necessarily that it's just the fact that they were able to make a living, and there was a lot of human wisdom involved in the society, right? If those things were around them and they crept into the congregation, of course people would have felt prideful because they felt like they had things covered. But Paul tells them to refrain from being puffed up. Okay, so I'm moving on now to what seems to happen in the second letter of Corinthians. It's kind of complicated, but it seems like Paul, because of some of the issues that is going on in Ephesus, has to leave. If you go to chapter 19, of Acts, chapter 19 of Acts, there's problems that happen. There's a riot in Ephesus, and it mentions later on that Paul meets with the elders of the Ephesians, and he kind of leaves. If you go to chapter 20, chapter 20, verse 1. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, departed to go to Macedonia. He kind of leaves and he goes up to Macedonia. It's not really clear exactly how this happens or where Paul writes the second letter. I don't think anybody really knows. All we know is that he does leave, and so the many adversaries, that goes to the riots that happened in Ephesus and him leaving, right? Well, he goes up to Troas. We do know that. While he's there, he writes to some of the things that are mentioned. Some of the things that are mentioned in 2 Corinthians is that he wants to find Titus. So it's possible that he wrote it in Troas. 2 Corinthians might be while he was going through Macedonia. I'm not sure it's exactly. Let me read just a little excerpt from Bob Waldron. This comes from, and if you don't know who Bob Waldron does, he is an individual who did a lot of work, especially in North Alabama. He currently lives in Florida, but he was one of my Bible teachers growing up. And anyways, this is just a very small excerpt from one of his outlines of Paul's letters chronologically. Just something he says here. The book of Acts tells us that Paul left Ephesus, so this is what we're talking about, on his third preaching trip. He went to Macedonia, chapter 20, verse 1, what we just read. But it is 2 Corinthians that tells us that he went northwest from Ephesus to Troas. Then across the sea to Macedonia. And as he was going through those parts of Macedonia, he wrote his second letter of Corinthians. So what I'm trying to say is there's kind of just an ambiguity, of where he wrote it. Macedonia is a giant region, so we're not exactly sure where, but he kind of mentions that he wants to find Titus and Troas, and then from there he leaves to go to Macedonia. On this slide, you see it going to Philippi. Not exactly sure if that's right or not, just going to Philippi, but he mentions that he doesn't feel rest until Titus comes. Titus was a very helpful asset to him. So anyways, on this journey from going to Troas to Macedonia, which, like I said, we have different verses telling us that those things happen. It's more likely that he wrote 2 Corinthians here. So fourth and fifth letters in a chronological order to put in your puzzle pieces are 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And like I said, the evidences that we have, especially in 1 Corinthians, are so clear to us. Okay, he literally says he was in Ephesus when he wrote it. After leaving Ephesus, it is believed that while he is in Macedonia, he probably writes the second letter. And he mentions some of the things that happened there. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 7. I do want to read that right there. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6 through 11. It's kind of actually start in verse 5. For indeed, when we came to Macedonia, right? So leaving Ephesus, going up to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, good grief, but we were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. Nevertheless, God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus, So he mentions that he hadn't seen Titus until he finally gets, with Titus. He says earlier how he wanted to see him, but he finally comes. So he's comforted by that. And not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was comforted in you when he told us of your earnest desire, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more. For even if I had made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it, for I perceive that the same epistle made you sorry, though only for a little while. Now I rejoice, not that you were made sorry, but that your sorrow led to repentance, for you were made sorry in a godly manner, that you might suffer the loss from us in nothing. For godly sorrow produces repentance leading to salvation, not to be regretted, but the sorrow of the world produces death. For observe this very thing, that you sorrowed in a godly manner, what diligence it produced in you, what clearing of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what vehement desire, what zeal, what vindication. In all things you proved yourself to be clear in this matter. So he talks about how Titus came from, almost like he came from Corinth, because he brings a good report. And Paul is so happy about that. And Paul, it's almost like he immediately reflects on the letter he had just written. He said, I had to be stern with you, right? It wasn't maybe the best. Paul talks about how he didn't really preach with the most eloquent of words or this or that, but his points were true and they were straightforward. And he said, if you guys were sorry for a little while, that was a good thing, because your sorrowful nature, your sorrowful spirit led to repentance. And that's godly sorrow. So Paul was very happy about that. And he was happy that Titus came after he was having so much troubles in Macedonia, right? He says he's being like basically pressed. And he says, I was happy when Titus came because Titus was here, but more importantly, because I heard the good things about y'all, how you guys were making changes. So do you see how that kind of connects there? I think it's really, if it's not clear, let me just outline it real quick. Paul, once again, says he's going up through Macedonia to Corinth, and he wants to spend the winter there. He goes up to Macedonia. Things aren't going good in Macedonia. He feels pressed, fears within, and dangers outside, conflicts on the outside. But he's happy because Titus comes back to him. And he's happy to see Titus. It's his friend. It's his companion. But Titus not only comes, but he also brings good report of Corinth. So it's almost like these things happened right next to each other, right? These things did not happen miles apart from each other, or I'm sorry, years apart from each other. It was almost like these things were boom, boom, boom. So really good information for us there. So Paul writes 2 Corinthians. Once again, it says Philippi from up there, but we don't know where he was. But he was in Macedonia. He writes the second letter to Corinth at this time. Some of the things mentioned in 2 Corinthians is talking about his escape from Asia. If you want to know where Asia is, go back to the map. Asia is where Ephesus is. So that's what he's talking about, how he had to leave there because of the riots. He advises about the person who had been disciplined, more than likely talking about 1 Corinthians 5, that individual who he was telling them to withdraw from, right? We already talked about the account of the man who had his father's wife, probably his mother-in-law. I'm sorry, his stepmother. I think I said mother-in-law earlier. It's his stepmother. I'm sorry. Advises them to receive him back because it seems like he had become sorrowful. He discusses himself, his apostolic ministry, urges fulfillment of the promise to give. We'll kind of come back to that. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I already know I'm going into 30 minutes at this point, maybe even past that. And I'm going to come back to that next week. He talks about how they gave. He wants to talk about false prophets, comparing his credentials with theirs. And he wants to, once again, if you look at chapter 13 of the end of 2 Corinthians, once again, like he ended in 1 Corinthians, I want to come back to y'all. Promises to come visit. And we'll kind of talk about that later on. So just to kind of put some of these things into perspective in a timeline, right at the start of Paul's third journey, he writes, right? Just make sure. Yeah. He writes from 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, about 5 years later. We want to say somewhere around that, from where he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But at the time that he was in Corinth, is probably on about maybe like a 2.5, 3 year gap from where he was in Corinth in chapter 18 and when he actually wrote the letters, at least the first letter, by the way. So, all right. So hopefully that's pretty clear to us. You need evidences to say, okay, this was probably the fourth and fifth letter written. Might have been the third and fourth. We'll talk about that next week, Lord willing. But the reason we're saying it, right, is because it's pretty obvious to us that he was in Ephesus when he wrote First Corinthians. He says it there. He says, I will tarry in Ephesus. And he talks about later on in Second Corinthians and in First Corinthians, how he was going to go one certain direction. And he does go in that direction in the book of Acts. And he says in Second Corinthians, I felt terrible, but then I got a good report that you guys have listened to my letter and all those things. So it's pretty clear to us that he wrote Second Corinthians not that far off of First Corinthians, and he was somewhere in the region of Macedonia. All right. If there are any questions or comments, I know I probably talked for about 40 minutes, and it's because there's a lot to be talked about here. And I hope this was beneficial to all of us. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to try to talk about the third and the sixth letter written. We'll kind of get into why we skipped ahead of those, so I don't want to give y'all too many spoilers. I think it'll be like this. It's almost like we're finding clues on a mystery or something like that. So, all right, thank you for your attention. I'm going to go ahead and end this call, and Lord willing, I will